All right. Everybody, warm welcome to this public meeting organised by Anti-Capitalist Resistance. And I am delighted to welcome back William I. Robinson, who I would describe, I hope this doesn't embarrass him, I would describe him as one of the leading Marxist theorists in the United States. Phil Hurst and I have been in communication with William for a period of some months now, exchanging ideas. I consider his latest book, I couldn't wait to read it. I read it as soon as I got hold of my copy, The Global Police State, to be a major contribution to our understanding as Marxists, as revolutionary socialists, of the development of the global crisis. So we are very, very lucky to have William with us this evening. Welcome, William, who's going to speak for about 45 minutes on the subject of his book, and then give us the rest of the meeting up until 8:30 for full discussion. Over to you, William.
Okay, well, hello everyone from both sides of the Atlantic, and thank you so much, Neil, for that for that introduction. And I want to thank Neil and Phil Hurst for Anti-Capitalist Resistance for inviting me, and say that there's been an incredibly inspiring and fruitful exchange that I've had with Neil and Phil over the last few months. I want to talk about global police state, but it's going to be a simplification in which I hope to present sort of the big picture. But I also want to really focus on global police state in relation to the current conjuncture worldwide, but also here in the United States, because here in the US, we are in a moment of inflection, really of extreme danger and of tremendous uncertainty. And more or less, this is the situation in countries around the world and in global capitalism as a whole. But I think in the next couple of 2-3 weeks, the epicenter is here in the US. What we have had, well, before the pandemic, but then as the pandemic has unfolded, social explosions worldwide, and of course the assassination of George Floyd sparked this massive uprising in the US. But more social and political explosions are really, at least here in the US, imminent. So the starting point for any discussion of global police state has to be the acute crisis of global capitalism. I wrote this book, I finished writing the book in October of 2019, so it came out before the pandemic. But the key point is that the global crisis was not caused by the pandemic. All the pandemic did is to aggravate many times over this crisis, really to accelerate the processes and the contradictions and the conflicts that were already underway in global capitalism. So what the pandemic has done is to make clear that capitalist states have been unable to cope with the crisis more generally and its intensification in the pandemic. They've been exposed as instruments of wealth and corruption, and this has pushed capitalist states around the world to intensify global police state. For me, the concept of global police state is essential to understanding where we're at in 2020, at this conjuncture, and more generally, the evolving nature of global capitalism. I mean three things by global police state, and in the course of the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to unpack this a little bit. I mean, first, that we see systems of transnational social control and repression and warfare extending all over the world, intensifying to contain the actual and the potential rebellion of the global working class and surplus humanity in the face of extreme and unprecedented inequalities and deprivation. The second thing I mean by this concept, because there are three dimensions to it, is that global police state has become an immensely profitable enterprise in the face of chronic stagnation in the global economy, in the face of a structural crisis of what we call overaccumulation. And this dimension of global police state is what I refer to as militarized accumulation and accumulation by repression. So this is an accumulation strategy. And the third thing I mean is that we're seeing this move accelerating now towards political systems that we can characterize as 21st century fascism. Now, I've pointed out in recent talks that each one of these three dimensions individually is not new, but they cannot be separated from one another. And we want to see how the three of these are intertwined in new ways that signal this extremely dangerous phase that we're moving into in global capitalism, with the severe crisis as the backdrop, and as the world is intensifying and really free falling into this repressive totality. But what I want to do now is focus on the last of these three dimensions for a moment, the threat of 21st century fascism, with a little bit of an excursion before I go back to summarizing the concept of global police state. Phil and Neil have been writing, coined the term creeping fascism, and have been writing about that for a number of years now, with regard to what's been going on, not just in recent years, but also over the last few decades. And I think that the idea of creeping fascism is a very apt description of what has been happening in recent times. But now, and at least in the United States, and I want to focus here on the US for a moment, we're moving from a project of creeping to fascism in the fast track. Things are coming to a head here in the US. I know there's 3 or 4 of us that are zoomed in the US, and I don't know how much detail you get about what's going on a daily basis on the ground here in the US on your side of the Atlantic. But things are really coming to a head right now around the elections, this electoral conjuncture. And I've made the statement over the last few months that we are moving towards civil war in the United States. And I don't mean a repeat of the 1860s. And I don't mean that literally over the next few weeks, we're going to be in civil war. But I want to just give you a sampling of some of the recent things that has happened here in the US in the context of this electoral political conjuncture. So you may have heard that just last week, fascist paramilitary militia in the US state of Michigan had been organizing a statewide coup d'etat. They had planned to storm, heavily armed, to storm the state capitol, to kidnap and possibly kill the governor of Massachusetts and other officials. And they had similarly been planning to kidnap the North Carolina government. Now, who are these people? Well, they're one of hundreds of far-right fascist paramilitary militias that have been feverishly organizing and taking to the streets and planning all across the United States. And this case in Michigan, we're talking about veterans of the US armed forces and white supremacists. Now, here's the key thing, that Trump, and I'll get to this later on, did not condemn this, but to the contrary, when he learned of this fascist assault, he condemned the governor. Now, I want to mention something that took place in 1924, but say that I am not suggesting here that the US in 2020 is Germany in 1924, but there is a certain historic event which gives us lessons about how things might be unfolding here. You might remember that that Hitler and the Nazis launched their famous, in 1924, beer hall push, in which they stormed a local government, and I think it was in Bavaria. And that was broken up. It was militarily a complete failure. Hitler was jailed for about 10 months. But the point is, in the aftermath of that, fascist organizing and Nazi organizing moved to a stage of intensified insurgency. Now, 21st century fascism will not be like 20th century fascism. I'll get back to that later, but we want to see just the seriousness of this event that took place in Michigan. But that's not all. And I'm just going to go into a scattering of other things that have taken place just in the last few weeks here in the US. And then I will link this to the larger theoretical analytical discussion of global police state. There have been an escalation of extrajudicial executions by paramilitary forces and this is the key point, state military and police forces. We've had this anti-racist uprising on the heels of the assassination of George Floyd, and in these mass protests, which involved 25 to 30 million people participating in them, the fascist, paramilitary fascist groups and the far right has been showing up, and white supremacists, and they are showing up heavily armed, and they have conducted numerous violent attacks and shootings in these anti-racist, almost exclusively peaceful demonstrations. One of the most serious events took place in the town of Kenosha in Wisconsin, when a 17-year-old white man belonging to one of these fascist paramilitary white supremacist organizations opened fire. He killed two unarmed protesters and injured a third while the police looked on. And then, of course, Trump did not condemn him, but once again condemned the protesters when this news reached the White House. So a few days later in Portland, and for a couple months, Portland was ground zero for this anti-racist uprising. So a white protester who was armed, the Black Lives Matter protests, a leftist protester, Michael Reinhold, saw that another armed fascist white supremacist was coming out with his gun at this protest and was threatening the protesters to shoot again. And so in what he said was self-defense, he shot this white supremacist. Now, after that happened, and he did not deny that he shot them, Trump, okay, this is the president of the United States, called for retribution. And just yesterday, he said that he ordered federal marshals to carry out an extrajudicial execution. And that's exactly what happened. This protester was surrounded by federal marshals. He was completely unarmed. He was eating a piece of candy. They surrounded him and extrajudicially executed him. But that's happening in other parts of the United States. A third example, fascist, and some reports have come out in recent months, we've known this for quite a long while, but it's accelerated now, that these fascist and white supremacist paramilitaries have been heavily infiltrating the Department of Homeland Security here and the police and the armed forces. Now, we don't have time in this brief Zoom meeting to go into a lot of detail on that, but there is very, very serious divisions and infighting within different sectors of the US capitalist state, including the different coercive branches. Nonetheless, the Department of Homeland Security is now, we see this fusion of state and paramilitary armed groups around the country in the context of this conjuncture. A couple other examples to conclude this this particular conjunctural analysis here where we're at. Massive voter suppression. Millions have already been disenfranchised. We've had a long history here, of course, of voter suppression and only a small portion of the population freely being able to exercise their vote. But now there's a massive disenfranchisement of millions, but there's more than that. We are seeing, and this has been called for by the Republican Party and by the White House, armed intimidation at voting centers. Voting has already begun. None other than Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr., has called for an army of what he called electoral security troops. He called on all able-bodied men and women to show up armed at voting stations. So an extreme form of electoral intimidation. And here in Southern California, I'm in Los Angeles, and in the one county over, Orange County, the Republican Party operatives in the county has set up these fake ballot deposit boxes because we can fill out our ballots early and drop them in government ballot boxes. So they've set up fake ones as if they're government ones, so misleading, and who knows what they'll do to them, that open them and throw the votes that are not for Trump away. And the courts here in Southern California ordered the Republican Party to pull them away, and the Republican Party operatives responded, no, we won't. We're going to leave them there. So what we're seeing, if you think about that, is a breakdown of the rule of law. The rule of law is breaking down. Now, it's very likely that Biden is way ahead in the polls. And by the way, Biden is a neoliberal. He's pushing and helped a key role in the United States in constructing global police state. Nonetheless, Biden is likely to be the winner in the actual voting. But what's very clear, what Trump has already made clear, and what these fascist forces and the Republican Party, the right wing of the Republican Party, which is in control of the Republican Party, and the Republican Party at this point is really, we can call it now, a fascist political party, has made clear that the strategy seems to be Trump will say that this was electoral fraud. He will call on his supporters for an uprising. He's already done that. And he might fail in this endeavor. In when he's going to call up his supporters, there might be some bloodshed here, but he might fail and Biden might become president, and he might not fail. But something else going on here is that we have a new nomination of hearings for a new Supreme Court justice. I want to take you back a moment in history, and I promise you, I will be getting in just a moment to the larger story of global police state. But this is the conjuncture in which we see global police state right now in the US. In the year 2000, the two candidates were George Bush and Gore. The key state, and whoever won that state would have won the elections, was Florida. And a vote recount was going on because it appeared there was some fraud and there was ballots that were not counted. And Gore was ahead in the vote recount. And if he had won Florida, he would have been president. At that moment, the Supreme Court interjected and said, no, we're calling an end to the recount and Bush is president. The coward, who doesn't want to upset the established social order in the face of a possible uprising in 2000 from below, Gore, then just conceded. But right now we have this extreme right nominee being she will surely be a member of the Supreme Court. And so part of what we might see in the next few weeks is that Supreme Court will confirm Trump's claim that there was voter fraud. So who knows what's going to happen in the next few weeks? But here's the thing. Even if Biden actually wins the elections and is inaugurated on January 20, both the fascist project, which is percolating, and the crisis of global capitalism will continue. It's here to stay. So that I wanted to jump into that at the beginning of the talk and now turn more of the analytical discussion of what I mean by global police state and what the book addresses. And the starting point here again is the crisis of global capitalism. The crisis is multidimensional. We cannot neglect the ecological dimension, which makes the crisis existential. And moreover, the ecological dimension involves hundreds of millions of climate refugees and all kinds of disruptions, which feeds into the other dimensions of this crisis. But the two dimensions I want to focus on here is the structural dimension of what we technically call overaccumulation, that is chronic stagnation in the global capitalist economy, and the political dimension of this crisis, which is one of state legitimacy and capitalist hegemony. So let me address these two particular dimensions of the crisis and start with structural or overaccumulation. So I will define what I mean by overaccumulation in just a minute, but this structural dimension originates in the circuits of capital production. It originates in the circuits of production. It's expressed, to use the technical term, in the rate of profit falling, the fall in the rate of profit. So if we study the global economy over the last few decades, actually we take the story back to the 1970s, which was the last big crisis before the one we're in now, the last big structural crisis, the rate of profit began to decline. It picked up a bit with the globalization boom of the 1990s and the early and turning into the 21st century, and then it began its further decline. In 2017, the rate of profit was 6%, but we want to remember that it seems high, or at least okay, 6%, but that's because certain sectors, particularly the tech sector and the banks, had a higher rate of profit, but in general, the rate of profit for capital in the other sectors continuing to decline to crisis levels from the perspective of capital. So what this means is that the capitalist class, and here I'm referring to the transnational capitalist class in general, has accumulated all of these profits, but cannot find productive outlets in the productive economy to invest and continue making profits. But overaccumulation is expressed, it might originate in the circuit of production, but it is expressed in the circuit of distribution, that is in the market, in the circuit of circulation. in the circuit of the global market is where we see this structural crisis. And we are in a period now of unprecedented global inequalities. You're surely familiar with the data that 1% of humanity controls over 50% of the world's wealth. In fact, the 8 richest billionaires control more wealth than the poorest half of humanity. But the more relevant piece of data here is that 20% of humanity controls 95% of the world's wealth. And that 20% is shrinking to 15, 12%. It will continue to shrink. But that means that 80% of humanity has just 5% of the world's wealth. So what's happening here is that the global market, the global economy produces all of this wealth, but the global market cannot absorb the output of the global economy. And that is what leads to the overaccumulation crisis and what leads to stagnation. Now, we've seen chronic stagnation in the global economy. Really, the first turning point was the dot-com bust and global recession of 2000, 2001. But really the big turning point here is 2008, the global financial collapse. So what we're seeing is this mass of accumulated capital cannot find outlets for profitable reinvestment. And the transnational capitalist class is then confronted with this dilemma. Where does it unload all of the surplus, all of the profits that it has accumulated? How does the transnational capitalist class continue to make profits? And now, remember, I'm simplifying here. So the transnational capitalist class is not a unified political bloc, intense competition among them, intense fissures and divisions. But what the transnational capitalist class shares is the defense and advancement of an open global capitalist economy, and shares also the political need to control and discipline the global working class and exploit it. But it has this dilemma. Where do you unload this surplus? So in 2010, the figure is higher now. I just don't have in front of me. I didn't fully do my homework here for today. Already, the leading transnational corporations were sitting on $12 trillion in cash reserves that they simply were not investing because there was no place to invest it. And remember, the global economy, the whole global GDP production of goods and services worldwide is 75 trillion. So 1/6 of that was simply uninvested cash sitting around. So the transnational capitalist class has turned to 3 mechanisms to sustain accumulation in the face of stagnation. The first of this is financial speculation. The whole global economy becomes a casino. And this data now I've gathered a couple years ago, and it's quite revealing that the global production of goods and services worldwide is valued at $75 trillion. But the speculation just in the derivatives, global derivatives market, and derivatives are speculation by definition, is $1.2 quadrillion. So you have 75 trillion in the real economy, 1.2 quadrillion just in derivatives speculation. And this wild speculation in the global casino has included stocks. That's why stock market reaches record highs, even though people are immiserated and the economy is in crisis. In derivatives, in currency speculation, in land grabs to turn land around the world simply into a speculative asset, in debt speculation, in the grabbing of real estate simply as speculation, turning assets into speculation, which push up prices and then intensifies inequalities and so aggravates the underlying structural problem. And there's no historic precedent to this level of financial speculation. It's leading to this, it has led already to extreme financial turbulence. And it does not, the thing is that it's pushes forward, but does not resolve the underlying structural problem of overaccumulation. So the second mechanism has been debt-driven growth. And worldwide, not just in the US and the rich countries, worldwide, consumer debt is at an all-time high. State debt is at an all-time high. One of the indicators of this state debt is the global bond market. Governments have to issue bonds, so they get money from banks and investors so they can pay their bills. And then they have to pay those bonds back with interest, and the global bond market has already surpassed $100 trillion. This is completely unprecedented. And corporate debt is at an all-time high. The actual total global debt right at the time I finished the book, in my last piece of data for it, September of 2019, was $215 trillion, which is almost 3 times the whole value of the global economy. So even before the pandemic, any major default with this debt situation would have triggered global recession, global depression, global crisis in any event. And of course, this mounting debt only aggravates the underlying structural problem. So the third mechanism, briefly, has been the plunder of public finance, completely reconfiguring public finance, neoliberal austerity, taxes, so forth and so on. I can go on. I'm in a lot of detail here, but really the model, if you want to see how the plunder of public finance comes together with all of this, is Greece from 2015 to present, really. And so this plunder of public finance involves a transfer of wealth from the working classes to capital. And so it only aggravates the underlying problem, the underlying structural problem of over accumulation. So the key point here now to link this to global police state, and one of those three dimensions, is that global police state now becomes another outlet for over accumulated capital to invest and make more profit. This is to say that global police state is an enormously profitable enterprise, and we are now living in a global war economy. This dimension of global police state I refer to as militarized accumulation and accumulation by repression. And these forms of accumulation are involving an ever more significant role in the global economy and in keeping the global economy going. I want to give just a little bit of data. So the book, of course, is theoretical, it's analytical, but it's also loaded, especially chapters 2 and 3, the middle two chapters, with a lot of data. I want to give you just a taste of that. So, of course, September 11 was a key turning point here because it allowed the ruling groups and the states to have a much more sweeping militarization of the global economy and society, and to really put in place fully a global war economy. And the Pentagon budget increased from 1998 to 2011 by 98%. It nearly doubled. Worldwide, from 2006 to 2015, public state military spending increased by 50% to over $2 trillion. That is 3% of the global world product. But this does not include state secret budgets, police and intelligence budgets, homeland security budgets, and so forth. If we add that, we're adding several trillions of dollars more. So we're talking about 5 to 6% or more of the global economy is just in state military spending. And this, in turn, does not include private, corporate, military, and social control and repression spending. So let me just point out that might even, I don't have the exact data, but that even surpasses, and it's linked up with state spending, but might even surpass it. By the way, the Middle Eastern wars alone waged by the United States have already involved $15 trillion. The wars, fake wars on drugs, on terrorism, are vast programs of militarized accumulation and accumulation by repression. Private military firms have proliferated in the last couple of decades. In fact, when the Soviet Union collapsed, no less than 10,000 private military firms, that's a nice word for mercenary firms, were formed in Russia. 20 million people now work worldwide in these private military firms. Another 20 million people worldwide work as private police. And in half of the countries in the world, private police outnumber public police. G4S is the world's largest private security firm. It has 660,000 employees. It's the third largest employer in the world after Foxconn and Walmart. Then we have, I'm just giving examples of how, apart from state military spending, which we've identified as several trillions of dollars, we have this private corporate spending on warfare, on repression, on social control. So the global biometrics industry was worth last year $35 billion, but it's rapidly growing. especially under the pandemic, it's taking off even further. And so it will amount to the hundreds of billions of dollars in the next few years. The European Union introduced for the first time in the early 21st century a border security program. And its spending on this so-called border security increased an unbelievable, this is from 2005 to 2016, 3,688%. And of course, this is private corporations are the ones that run these so-called border security programs. Private prisons are proliferating around the world. It's not just a phenomenon for the United States at all. There's currently 200 private prisons on all continents, and they're expanding very rapidly. There's a multi-billion-dollar, and this is going to go also into the hundreds of billions of dollars over the next few years, what the corporations are calling a global riot control systems market. And here is an actual quote from the global business intelligence firm, which is monitoring and promoting this riot control systems market worldwide. Says there will be a dramatic rise of civil unrest in the next few years, and this will generate demand for riot control systems. So what this means is you have this massive civil unrest in the United States, whether it's anti-racist or the fascist, whatever it is, that might be part of a political crisis, but that's wonderful news for corporations that produce and market and make profit from so-called riot control systems. And so this goes on and on, on and on. That's just a sampling of these examples of increasing centrality of global police state in the face of the crisis of stagnation. But it's more complicated than that. I'll just give an example of how this plays out. So you have, I think I have this example in the book, but I might not. But in Ecuador, mining companies want to get at and are getting at indigenous lands in the Amazonian area in Ecuador. And one of the biggest mining companies, China, is more involved than US or Canadian mining companies in Ecuador. China is not a socialist country in solidarity with poor people around the world. So these Chinese mining, capitalist mining companies have gone into indigenous lands in Ecuador, and the indigenous have protested. And so the Chinese mining company hires one of these private military firms to send troops and police privately into the mining area to the Amazon to repress the indigenous and to provide military security to the mining operation. So even if the mining operations, which I don't know what percentage of the global economy they represent, are not themselves militarized accumulation, they involve militarized accumulation and accumulation by repression. So it's really even hard to wrap our mind around just how central global police state is to the functioning of the global capitalist economy. So that's the second. I mentioned there's these three dimensions of global police state coming together. That's the second, which is a profitable operation. I want to go back to the first dimension, which is the political one, the crisis of state legitimacy and of capitalist hegemony. And I had already pointed out this extreme inequality and deprivation in global society. And we want to see that such extreme inequality and extreme deprivation requires extreme control, repression, and militarization. The title of chapter 2 in the book that talks about this dimension is Savage Inequalities, which is putting it mildly. What we have is the mass of humanity, that 80%, and again, I won't get into the analysis now, but it's actually going to be more than 80% because high-skilled, high-paid workers, knowledge, cognitive workers are themselves being de-skilled and made redundant by digitalization. So those ranks are going to expand. But at the time that I finished writing this book, we have these two groups within the global working class. First, we have surplus humanity. Those that have been pushed out of the global economy, that are structurally unemployed and locked out and marginalized. And the International Labor Organization puts that figure at 1/3 of the working population in the world, 2 billion people whose only option is to go into the informal sector, to scratch out a living in any way you can, or to die. And of course, once you go into this informal sector, you can be criminalized because of some of your different survival strategies. So I have a good friend and comrade, Juan Manuel, is zooming in from Mexico, and he knows very well that the so-called war against drugs in Mexico is not a war against drugs. It's a war for primitive accumulation in Mexico and for social control in Mexico. And it's a war in which the different ruling groups will get different pieces of the immense profit to be made there. But of course, there are hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, I don't know how many, of poor, impoverished, and miserated Mexicans who have no choice but to be at the lowest bottom rungs of drug production and trade and processing in Mexico, simply as a survival strategy, and they can be criminalized. So that feeds into the profitability of criminalizing. So that's surplus humanity, 2 billion people. And then the International Labor Organization tells us that 1.3 billion workers, that is those that actually one or another way have employment, official employment in the global economy, are working in precarious work arrangements. That's the so-called new precariat. And that is expanding. So we have the combination of surplus humanity or superfluous labor with super exploited labor, labor super exploited and super disciplined through precarious arrangements. And if we put them together, this is the vast majority of the global working class that needs to be disciplined and controlled and repressed. And there is currently a new wave of global economic restructuring. As we speak, it's being accelerated by the pandemic, and a new wave of global capitalist expansion through digitalization and fourth industrial revolution technologies. And so this new wave of global capitalist restructuring and expansion is rapidly expanding the ranks of these two categories of the global working class, those made surplus or superfluous and those super exploited through precarious arrangements. So the ruling groups are acutely aware. And did I mention that the pandemic is rapidly deepening this inequality? You're probably familiar with this. Just a couple of headlines right here. That in the first 6 months of the pandemic, US billionaires increased their wealth by $845 billion. At the same time as 50 million people lost their job, as homelessness and as hunger and malnutrition is spreading all across the United States. The poor are getting dramatically poorer. People are facing mass insecurity. The billionaires increased their wealth by nearly $1 trillion, just 643 billionaires led by the tech and financial billionaires. Just yesterday, the banks released their quarterly earnings, and they have an all-time high. Banks' all-time high earnings. And then a day after I printed this article, the next one came out. Billionaires around the world, their wealth rose to $10.2 trillion in the first 6 months of the coronavirus crisis, which is a 30% increase. So these inequalities are intensifying, which means the need for social control and repression of the mass of humanity is intensifying. But what I want to say is that the transnational capitalist class, their leading representatives and politically organized sectors of the transnational capitalist class and global political elites in general, they are acutely aware of this actual and potential threat from below, from mass revolt, from mass uprisings. And they're aware that they want to turn to global police state because they need to. So a couple of quotes, and I just pulled the first two of these is taken out of the book. The third one is much more recent. So again, to give you an example that the transnational capitalist class and its political operatives and global elites are aware of this need to intensify control through global police state. Johann Rupert, he's the CEO of Cartier, which together with Tiffany's are the big elite luxury jewelers worldwide. And he said in an interview last year that I mentioned in the book, this guy Rupert, that he can't get to sleep at night because every night he's worried about the poor rising up and overthrowing the system. And he's also worried that his high income elite consumers of the luxury jewelry won't buy his jewelry because they're scared that the ostentatious show of this jewelry will make them targets for an uprising. And one other quote here, this is reported by an editor of the Financial Times of London, where many of you are now. And this editor writes, because she was interviewing billionaires. One thing I've been hearing from a lot of very wealthy people these days since the US election of 2016 of Donald Trump is that they all have escape plans. Rich people are buying up ranches in New Zealand and creating bunkers in the Bahamas or wherever they're going, thinking that they're somehow going to be able to avoid the apocalypse when it comes. There's actually a business that operates in New York. It is a boat that will come. You can apparently pre-buy tickets. If there's some political crisis or some danger moment, they'll come and pick you up and whisk you up the Hudson. So the global elite are creating their bunkers and their escape plans as they beef up global police state, the repressive dimensions. One final quote. I just want to see what I'm doing on time. So I'm nearing a conclusion here, but I want to point out one other quote that just happened very recently after the book was finished writing it and it came out. And another one of these politically members of the global transnational capitalist class that are politically active is the sociopathic billionaire Elon Musk. And Musk has a dynasty. He's increased his wealth by almost 300% during the pandemic. And he's worth nearly $100 billion now. But the thing is that he started making the first electrical cars, the Tesla cars. And the batteries in those electrical cars need lithium. The biggest deposits worldwide for lithium are in two countries, in Bolivia and in Chile. And in Bolivia, Evo Morales, the indigenous president, was overthrown in a coup d'etat, as you know, in last October of 2019. Now, whatever critique we can have of Evo Morales and the program wasn't revolutionary enough, whatever we can say about it, the lithium fields in Bolivia were public. They were made public. So they were going to be heavily taxed, and that tax was going to be used for social programs. So that was not to Elon Musk's liking. So in July, that's 3 months ago, the US Congress was debating another stimulus bill, and Elon Musk sent out a Twitter, and I quote from the tweet. The government stimulus package is not in the best interests of the people. So someone tweeted back to Elon Musk saying, you know what isn't in the best interests of the people? That the US government organizes a coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia so you can obtain the lithium there. And Musk tweets back, and this is the clincher in what I'm quoting to you, we will coup whoever we want, deal with it. So here you see a politically conscious member of the transnational capitalist class explaining how he is going to utilize the global apparatus of the global police state, one, to get at the lithium so he can accumulate capital, and secondly, to repress the Bolivian people in the process. So you see these two dimensions coming together here. Perfect illustration of global police state. So what we're seeing here then, to bring the accumulation function of global police state and the political control function of global police state together, we're seeing a convergence of global capitalism's political need for social control and its economic need to perpetuate capital accumulation and profit making in the face of stagnation. So again, I'm not going to go into detail here. It's all in the book, but some of these new draconian new modalities of policing and repression and social control made possible through digital technologies include these systems of mass incarceration, these immigrant detention and deportation regimes everywhere around the world, because the epicenter here is the United States and also Europe, refugee control systems, border containment walls, mass surveillance and tracking systems, which are expanding dramatically through the pandemic itself, militarized urban policing, which has been showcased in all of the cities here in the United States over the last 6 months with the George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests. And we're seeing also, as part of this new modalities of repression and social control, we're seeing a restructuring of space all around the world, and especially in the global mega cities. These mega cities, and here, of course, I'm talking about Los Angeles and New York and London and Paris and Bonn and Mexico City and Jakarta and Sao Paulo and Rio and Mumbai and Shanghai, so forth and so on. You get the picture. Cairo. These megacities are really the theaters, the battlegrounds of global police state, even though there's still rural counterinsurgency and so forth. And they are also the sites of resistance struggles. the leading edge of resistance struggles. And so that's where global police state rains down. And what we're seeing in the megacities is a restructuring of space. In the book, I call this the green zoning and the gray zoning, especially of the cities, but worldwide. And the reason I'm using that term, and let me see how I'm doing on time, so I'll be wrapping this up in a moment. The reason I'm using that term is because the US invaded and occupied Iraq in 2003. And when they invaded, they went into Baghdad and set up in the center of Baghdad what the US invaders called the green zone. And they set up an impenetrable barrier around that green zone. Nothing could get in, nothing could get out, even most bombs or anything like that could not penetrate it. And inside, of course, were the occupation forces, the political and the generals, and also the political occupation forces, but also the new Iraqi elite, political and economic elite being cultivated and put into local power through the US invasion. And then outside was all-out warfare and unbelievable misery, murder, mayhem, blood, death for the rest of the Iraqis. So what we're seeing in all of the megacities around the world is these creation of the green zones through gated communities, through all kinds of new surveillance systems, through the restructuring of space, through gentrification. And it's these green zones are heavily protected by global police state. And outside the green zones is this mass repression and social control systems, which is heavily repressed by global police state. So this restructuring of space is part of new patterns of capital accumulation, but also new patterns of how you organize space when you have an 80-20% global society, and how global police state becomes activated in this regard. Just in California, to give an example, a hands-on example of this, how you control space. There are 592 laws on the books here in the state of California where I live, restricting standing, sitting, sleeping, panhandling, food sharing, and so forth in public spaces. So these almost 600 laws allow for a total control of public spaces, allows for criminalization of some, of course, and this is in part directed against homeless people, but not in the least bit limited to homeless people. And by the way, just in a parentheses before I make my conclusion now, I'm not quite sure what it looks like these days in the streets of London or wherever you are in the UK. And I know there's at least one person from Mexico, and then we have some people on this side. But as I drive around in Los Angeles, literally by the day, there's tent cities. I mean, the amount of homeless people is so skyrocketing, we don't even have data. Even in the wealthier areas, you cannot go anywhere in the city without passing 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 tents. And in that tents are whole families. And that doesn't include homeless people that are not living in tents in the streets because they live out of their cars, or homeless people that 2 or 3 families that become homeless live with a relative that might have a one-room apartment. So anyway, I'm getting sidetracked to just point out how global police state becomes so much more critical to global capitalism in the face of this intensified deprivation. So let me conclude. Let me conclude now where we started, with the third dimension of global police state, which is this threat of 21st century fascism. Actually, I wanted to read one more quote. Sorry, backtrack for 1 second, because this quote is so shocking. I got this also after I completed the book. But in 2017, the US Army published a report, The Operational Environment and Changing Character of Future Warfare. That's the name of the US Army's report that was leaked. And here's a little quote from it. The convergence of more information and more people with fewer state resources will constrain governments' efforts to address rampant poverty, violence, and pollution, and create a breeding ground for disaffection among increasingly aware, yet still disempowered populations. And then it goes on. A global populace that is increasingly attuned and sensitive to disparities in economic resources and the diffusion of social influence, thanks in part to the internet and instant communications, will lead to further challenges to the status quo and lead to systems rattling events. And these systems rattling events they mention are monetary crises, mass migration, refugee crises, homelessness, Arab Spring uprisings, and so forth. And then it says, and the Z generation, you know, is the youngest generation, the one with the least stake in global capitalism, people born at the turn of the century. The report concludes that the US military needs to prepare for a Z-bellion. Z-bellion means a rebellion, which will shatter, which will dramatically challenge the whole global status quo, led by the Z generation and millennials in the year 2025, so that the US Army should be preparing for that. So to conclude, where we started, this threat of 21st century fascism, we want to remember that fascism, whether in the 20th or 21st century variant, is a particular far-right response to crises of capitalism. And more specifically, fascism seeks to rescue capitalism from its organic crisis, to violently restore capital accumulation while at the same time suppressing threats from below, unencumbered by democratic constraints, and to violently establish in new forms state legitimacy, which is eroded and collapsing. So for me, the key some key things to look at in 21st century fascism, first is this triangulation. The project of 21st century fascism brings together capital, in this case, transnational capital, and its need to accumulate, with repressive and reactionary political power in the state, with a fascist mobilization in civil society. This triangulation is the formula for 21st century fascism. The two models that we can see it with such crystal clarity right now is the United States and India. The United States, of course, you have Trumpism and the fascist Republican Party is that repressive power trying to consolidate itself in the US state. You have this massive fascist mobilization, civil society that I discussed earlier. And of course, you have the role of transnational capital, such as Musk and the Elon Musk quote that I read to you. In India, you have Modi in the state. You have the RSS, which is a truly fascist organization in civil society. And you have the Indian billionaires are an intimate part of that whole project. The second thing to remember about 21st century fascism is what does it promise? Why can it possibly succeed? Because it's promising to restore stability and security and to relieve mass social anxiety at a time of crisis and destabilization for masses of people. And for this reason, fascism has to organize a mass social base. If it doesn't, it's not a fascist system. It might be authoritarian or right-wing repressive. The third thing to keep in mind in 21st century fascism is that the mechanism is a sublimation of this social anxiety, right? Of this insecurity, sublimated towards scapegoated communities, classically a Nazi that was Jews, and in India, it's Muslims and lower castes. In the United States right now, it's particularly immigrants, but also a sublimation through creation of external enemies. So in part, this building up of US war towards China and aggression towards China has more to do with creating an external enemy to sublimate internal political and social tension and crisis than it does with US-Chinese competition for world hegemony. And then finally, remember that the key thing of fascism, and this holds true for both 20th and 21st century, is this discursive or ideological repertoire that it has, which includes, of course, extreme nationalism, this notion of national regeneration. I mean, that was the whole cornerstone originally of the Nazis, but of course, just think of Trump saying, "Make America Great Again," or Modi with his Hindu nationalism, xenophobia, race, culture, supremacy, martial masculinity, millennialism, normalizing and even glorifying war, social violence, and domination. So the crucial point here, though, and what's the difference between, in part, 20th and 21st century fascism, one of the differences, and I'm going to be concluding with this point, is that given the nature and the crisis of global capitalism, the ruling groups cannot provide a material payoff to any would-be mass base of fascism. Now, they might be able to in some of the Eastern European fascist programs. They're also talking about a populist distribution of wealth and social programs. But in India, and especially in the US, we see no material payoff to the fascist would-be base. only a psychological wage. And that's why racism and other things of that sort become so important. So that leads us, by way of conclusion, to say, so what's the social basis of 21st century fascism? Well, for me, they are sectors of the global working class and middle strata in global south and in the global north that were formerly privileged in the 20th century, particularly, for instance, in the United States, the white sectors of the US working class and disproportionately male that were able to get secure high wage jobs and stability and so forth in the 20th century is now completely destabilized with deindustrialization, with restructuring and so forth. And so that is what they're trying to organize beyond the actual open fascists that I discussed earlier as I opened up the presentation. But what that means is that a fascist response to the crisis is not automatic. These masses of people need to get from ruling groups, through their ideological representatives, through the corporate media, through their intellectual representatives of the ruling groups, they need to get a certain interpretation of the crisis, which leads them to fascism. But that means that the left, and especially the socialist left, can give and has to put forth an alternative interpretation of the crisis and where that social insecurity and anxiety and destabilization is coming from. So we have a key role here. But and I'll end with this, I'm not ending in a pessimistic note, but rather a jumping off point for us socialists to discuss, that we have a dangerous situation currently, especially really worldwide, but right here in the United States, that we have this burgeoning of these mass social movements and resistance on every front imaginable, but we don't